Welcome everyone and good afternoon. Happy Thursday. I hope that you are all having an excellent day and that it is warmer where you are than it is where I am. I'm freezing here in Adelaide. I'm on Kaurna land and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging of both Kaurna people and also of the lands wherever you are seated, standing right now. And I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, that the privilege that I enjoy came at great cost to many others, and that injustice and inequality continues to this day. As we discuss the issues around demographics and migration today, I at least am imagining a future where both the first and last peoples to live on First Nations land are all able to know full equality, justice, and peace. My name is Brad Chilcott. If I haven't met you before, I'm the founder of Welcoming Australia, and I'm also an associate director at Essential, who are one of the partners helping to make this event happen daily at 1 p.m, this Australia at Home series. Our other partners are The Guardian and Principal Co. And we also have the support of a bunch of excellent community partners, the Community Council for Australia, ACF, Maurice Blackburn, and more. And we're all about getting Australian civil society together throughout this pandemic to share ideas, to motivate each other, and to together create a fairer, more equal and more sustainable society. I reckon it's really nice when we are on these events if we can all see each other as much as possible. So if you want to do that, turn your Zoom setting onto gallery view, and then you get to see everyone's beautiful faces and get a nice sense of who is with us. If you've not used Zoom before, there is a chat function. You can see that at the bottom of your screen. You click on chat, it'll pop up to the right. And in the chat today, you will meet Hannah, who is our tech support person. Hannah's from Essential Media as well. You can ask her your questions if something isn't working for you. You'll find that you're on mute automatically, and that is because 140 people, which is how many people we have with us right now talking at the same time, just doesn't work. So if you have questions, you can put them up in the chat and we'll throw to some of you throughout the course of our conversation. I also would like to say, please keep the chat kind and inclusive, and if it gets too hectic in there, we will have to either boot you from the meeting or shut the chat down entirely. So you can chat away, say friendly, kind things to one another, and say how excellent our two speakers are today. Put your questions up, but please, nothing racist or in any other way, denigrating to people that are in this conversation. So it's very great to have Dr. Liz Allen and Abul Rizvi with me today for this conversation. Dr. Liz is a demographer for the Centre for Social Research and Methods at ANU, and the author of a book that is formally being launched tonight called The Future of Us. And I just finished reading it yesterday. It's excellent. Dr. Liz, why don't you tell us how you've personally coped with this lockdown period as a way of introduction?
I must admit I've struggled on many fronts, but also in home and close to the family and close to my important networks, which are my children and my partner. And I've decided I do like them. I do need to go for walks regularly though to get away from them, but I do like them, that's pleasing. But I guess the experience for me has really opened my eyes to a number of things that I talk about in my work, and those issues around the gender inequalities of work, and both paid and unpaid work, and also this idea of, well, can we all telecommute to work? And if that's the case, then maybe we can take some congestion off our roads in more effective ways.
Indeed. Well, Abul, it's great to have you with us as well. Abul Rizvi, you might have seen his pieces in the Sydney Morning Herald or The Guardian, other places, but he's a former assistant director I hope I got that title right, at the Department of Immigration. He ran the joints, is a good way of putting it, and many other roles in high level in the civil service. So, Abul, it's great to have you with us today, and looking forward to hearing your insight. But first, tell us how lockdown has been for you in this time.
I think perhaps like many people, I assume initially it was fearfulness of, oh geez, this is a bit of a worry, and I remember someone arriving at our door after we'd been sort of in lockdown for 4 or 5 days, and all of a sudden there's someone at the door, and there was that sort of fearfulness. But as we've gone on and things have started to open up a little bit, I think it's been more frustration at not being able to visit family and friends and that sort of thing, which I think we're all suffering from. But, you know, to give everyone credit, Australia's just done so remarkably well. It's just extraordinary.
Indeed, and especially here in Adelaide, where I get to actually have friends over now. So we're very lucky here. We had family friends around last night, and our kids got to play. We had a fire. It was fantastic. We'll go to Dr. Liz now. You explain in your book, The Future of Us, click the link in the chat and purchase yourself a copy, how the study of demography centres on population and the dynamics of change. You look at births, deaths and migration. The book has a whole lot of projections in it about what the future might look like. And I'm interested in how the pandemic will affect those projections. On face value, I guess migration goes down because no one can come here. But it seems to be the common thought that birth rates go up because everyone's at home getting busy. So is that the real story or not?
People might be at home getting busy and doing all sorts of weird and funky things behind closed doors. And if that's you, congratulations. But it's not going to result in the spike of births or a baby boom or coronials that some people have suggested. So as you said, the book includes quite a few different scenarios of what the future might hold given different net overseas migration intake levels. So in answer to your question, the book still holds with regard to what we might see into the future with regard to population characteristics. And when I say characteristics, I mean those overall composition of age, sex distribution. But in terms of those major inputs, we have on one hand, net overseas migration, which is the difference between those coming and going. And on the other hand, we have natural increase, which of course comes from the balance of births and deaths. And when we commonly talk about births, we're talking about the birth rates that take account of the structure of the population. We're already seeing a downward slide in terms of birth rates. It's likely we're going to see that further pushed down, and we're not going to see people stuck inside having lots of sex and having lots of babies. It doesn't work that way. We need more than that to have a baby boom. We need partnering. And at the moment, the lockdown, shutdown, whatever we want to call it, is a major disruption to relationship formation. Because you need to actually physically see someone to do the deed, right? To be able to have something that comes out at the end, a baby, potentially or not. So while we might have sexually transmitted infections going down, hooray, because things like Tinder and the like are off limits at the moment, we're not going to see coronials, an entire boom. My concern is we might actually and more likely see foregone babies, those that will never be born into the population, missing children, if you like, because of the uncertainty and the pressure that we're experiencing at the moment. People have lost jobs. People are experiencing enormous pressure. They've lost their entitlements. The other thing too is that we're in the midst of pretty significant climate change that is not being addressed. And as a result of that, people fearful as well of what the future might hold. So we're in the poo big time. And the the coronavirus crisis has just, I guess, dug the hole deeper and wider. And if we're not careful, we're going to be set very deep in the demography poo, if you like.
Yeah, as you mentioned, that we already were in a bit of we were in the situation where our population was aging and the birth rate was going down. It was already going to pose a challenge, many challenges to our future before the interruption of the pandemic. But what does all this mean for how we need to plan for our recovery? We're already going to need to address the challenges now that we've had the interruption of the pandemic. What are the things we need to think about in terms of how we recover from this moment?
Population is a slow-moving train. It's not something that just pops out of the blue. We can look to the past, see what's been happening, stand in the now, given what we know about the past. We can, on the cusp, consider what might be, given what has been, right? So we're in a very advantageous position in Australia with our data and what we know about social trends and the like. So we can, I guess, now consider how are we going to be best prepared and best responsive to what our country needs. We are headed into, and I know the word's been used quite a lot, and I'm going to use it, unprecedented, people. It's unprecedented. Yeah, look, it's a swear word almost. So it is truly unprecedented, but we can prepare and we can plan and be responsive to our needs. It's about building the nation, and it's about ensuring that we know what we want to be, where we want to get to. And it's not about controlling population numbers or setting a target for our total population figures, but rather considering all of the dynamics of what is necessary to ensure that we have an economically sustainable population that ensures our well-being into the future matches that of the past, if not exceeds it.
So choices around migration are going to make a huge difference in that mix. It's often presented as kind of this binary choice between higher migration and lower migration. But in your book, you explain that it's much more complex than that. Would you like to touch on that for a moment before I throw to Abul?
Yeah, we often think about numbers. It comes down to, do we support immigration or not? And with that, it's this fear of that we have what some have called an open door immigration policy, and the conjures this image of us being flooded and being overtaken by the so-called other. And that's really concerning from a public discourse, because whether we like it or not, if we look at our demography, if we look at our aging population, we need to ensure that we have a robust proportion of people in the working age ranges to be able to support those at either end, the cradle and the grave end of our life course. And we need to move beyond this idea of, well, are you for or against? It's not about the numbers, it's about what we're made of. And we need to be considering, what are we made of? What do we need to be made of with regard to that composition, in particular, our age distribution?
Yeah, great. Thanks. Abul, you kind of touched on this idea about migration attitudes being about more than the number or the quantum, but you came at it from a bit of a different angle. You were imploring in your recent Sydney Morning Herald article politicians to get away from a false dichotomy of temporary migrants are bad and permanent migrants are good. What did you mean by that, and how does that relate to what Dr. Liz has been sharing?
Our temporary entry migrants cover a vast array of visa classes. Your mind boggles when you look at the number of them, and you know, I ran the system for over a decade and I can't remember them all. And you know, people mention numbers to me. I think I remember that one. And the same exists for our permanent residents, a vast array of visa categories. All of those visa categories, particularly on the temporary side, cover a vast range of length of periods in which people are allowed to stay, a huge range of conditions under which the visas operate. To think about them as a lump, which is the temporary bad, permanent good sort of mantra, I think really is doing the Australian public a disservice. That's simplifying the world in a way that just is not true. Simplification is often good, except when it's inaccurate, then it's bad. And I think what has happened is that we have just oversimplified it. It is true that what you don't want to do is to allow a large build-up of people on temporary visas in the country who are in what I described as immigration limbo. They can't go home and they can't go through to permanent residence. You don't want a large group of that form. Generally in our history, we haven't had a large number in that situation. Unfortunately, we do now. So if you think of people on temporary protection visas, for example, whilst the numbers are small at only about 18,000, but still growing as cases are processed, those people have nowhere to go. They've been here a long time. They can't go home. They've been recognised as refugees, and they can't get permanent residence. To me, having large numbers of people who are in that circumstance is a bad thing. We have at the moment overseas students, large numbers of overseas students who are in a similar situation. They have invested enormously in their education in Australia with the intention of migrating, and I believe there is nothing wrong with that. The government system encourages that. But at the same time, what the government has subsequently done is pulled back on permanent migration, which has meant large numbers of international students who had intended to migrate now cannot. They are in limbo. That's what we've got to avoid.
And I guess that part of the argument around temporary migration is that it creates an opportunity for exploitation, wage theft. You know, we hear talk of an underclass of workers being created without the same rights and conditions as permanent residents.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned international students. We know their numbers are going up, and in fact, temporary worker numbers are going down slightly, but international students are also very susceptible to workplace exploitation, as are people on bridging visas. So how do we make sure that no one is getting exploited in Australia and that temporary migration doesn't put downward pressure on wages and conditions overall? Of course, if an employer thinks they can get cheap labour out of someone, they probably will. How do we avoid that situation?
I think there's two parts of the problem here. The first part is exploitation appears to have become endemic in Australia. It's not just temporary entrants, it's permanent migrants. Indeed, it's young Aussie citizens get exploited and have their wages stolen. So we have a very large problem there. And the government has said it is going to introduce legislation to start dealing with that issue. My fear is the legislation will be light touch compared to a very, very, very big problem. I think Australia needs to have a fundamental look at the issue of exploitation as as something that it's got to deal with comprehensively. The second part of it is there are some visa categories that are indeed designed poorly such that they make exploitation a higher risk. We need to deal with those visas as well. I don't believe those visas are large in number, but they're there.
So if you were in your old job again right now, and you are sitting with the minister, probably more enjoyably with Tudge than Dutton, but if you were sitting with the minister, what would your primary pieces of advice be today?
Well, leaving aside the exploitation issue, which I think is almost number one, and assuming the government is prepared to do something comprehensive in that space, there are three other things that I would highlight. The first is we've got to get the visa system back under control. And I know for some people that will sound a little odd. For some people, it will sound a bit right-wing. But the importance of getting the visa system under control is about confidence. That is, the Australian public can have confidence that the system is being managed in the national interest and is not being taken advantage of by spivs and carpetbaggers and all the rest of it. There is substantial evidence that our system has lost control. And I can go through lots of indicators if people are interested, but that'll probably bore people, I don't know.
Just a couple, give us a couple.
I'll give you a couple of examples. 25% of net migration to Australia happens through people arriving on visitor visas and then applying for something else. That is not how the system is designed. That should not be happening. If you get more than about 5%, there is something wrong. 25% is really bad. 280,000 people on bridging visas tells you the system is not operating properly. There is something wrong. They're just two examples. A third example would be 100,000 people on partner visa applications. That is wrong. That should not happen. 100,000 non-genuine asylum seekers in the country. The vast majority of them are going to be refused. They were brought in, as I would say, by the spivs and the carpetbaggers to be exploited, and they're being exploited. That should not be happening. They are just three examples of where the system is out of control. So I would say to the Minister, let's get the system back under control. The third thing I would say is we need to do a comprehensive review of our visa classes. I think they are no longer fit for purpose. Too much tinkering for much too long. And the third thing I would say is, in terms of the process of developing immigration policy and setting immigration levels, we need to go back to a process which is highly consultative and highly transparent. I recall when Ruddock was Minister, and many people will scream, you know, Ruddock, evil man, and all the rest of it. I guess I had a different view of him, having worked closely to him for almost a decade. One thing that he did that was good was every year he would travel the country, both every major capital city and a range of regional cities, and he would give a 40-odd minute presentation on immigration policy, and then he would stand up for an hour and a half and take questions. Can you imagine Peter Dutton doing that? But you need to do that, because if you do that, you show that you are open to people and that you are open to take their ideas and suggestions, and that you are open to redesigning the system in the national interest. We've gone into a system which is now just extraordinarily secretive.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to imagine us having a big rational conversation around migration with the way that it is often hijacked by those who want to create fear and division, and, you know, sometimes using phrases like genuine and non-genuine when we come to refugees, and accusing people of coming to steal our jobs and all of that stuff. Dr. Liz, you mentioned in your book that you think Canada is like our demographic cousin in regards to migration and population. But I would also add that one stark difference is the kind of prevailing political conversation there, at least recently. And so I guess my question is, if immigration is so important for our economic survival and growth and recovery, why do politicians drive anti-migrant sentiment? Of course, you can say because it works at elections, and we know that fear and division is a great election winning strategy, but it's a terrible nation building strategy. So could it be, this is me with my progressive conspiracy theory hat on, but could it be that if you turn people against those who are different, it becomes okay to pay people less and offer them less rights and generally use them as economic units rather than as citizens whose vote counts and whose standard of living really matters? Are they trying to create an underclass that can be exploited, and by dividing us, make us fine with that exploitation?
I think that would be an interesting aspect to explore, but I'd offer you perhaps a different suggestion, and call me naive and perhaps a little bit too optimistic. But if we look again at our history, and if we look at our demographic past, even when we had massive immigration of displaced people post-World War II, there was still, that wasn't something that the government of the day came to lightly. They had to be kind of not coerced, but their hand had to be held politically by world players to get to a position where we welcomed so many displaced people after, you know, a horrific global situation. So we have a long history in Australia of not recognising our Black history. We focus on our white Australia narrative, and we kind of put our blinkers on and consider, because of, and I would point back to policies of the past, these lingering white Australia policy sentiment that we're still suffering from. If you think about it, you know, I'm going to say my age and brag a little bit, but I wasn't alive when the white Australia policy came to an end. But I was raised in a family and an environment and in a society, a community that was raised under a white Australia policy. So the norms were socially entrenched, and racism and those matters of norms occur over communications over the kitchen sink, over the kitchen table at dinner time and the like. And so it's very normal, unfortunately, that we're still going back to this idea of this white Australia minus a black past, a black history, and focusing on what a so-called dominant Australia is. Of course, that dominant Australia is no longer what we think it is, and the statistics shows us that. So in terms of why is it so effective to use immigration to draw a wedge? Well, it's effective, right? Why do it? Well, it's interesting because if we look at the government data on this, the government on one hand, this kind of paradox within government forward estimates, the things that underpin the government funds, they're heralding how great immigration is, and with welcoming arms, they government officials trot across the globe saying, come to Australia, we're fantastic. But in the Australian media, and that front is, well, poo-poo on them. We want to have the white Australia continue. Those sorts of sentiments exist. What's so interesting about Canada, on the other hand, is that in Canada at their recent election, there was partisan support that immigration was an important feature. Multiculturalism especially was an important feature of the Canadian society. And when a small right-wing group erected billboards calling on so-called mass immigration or open door immigration to end, there was a massive backlash. And that's quite interesting, is we've become accustomed to kind of foul language and those sorts of niggling comments that open and allow us to be more intolerant than we should be. We allow those to fester here, and I think Canada's different. They don't allow it, and it's because it comes down to political leadership on all parts, all sides of and all stripes of our leadership.
Yeah, so it's very clear, I guess, that on an economic level, our politicians know that they need immigration, and so they keep it going. However, the prevailing language then causes obviously suffering for the individuals that are experiencing the racism that flows, and devalues people as humans rather than economic units. And Neha
Right.
from Democracy in Colours Online, she has a question to ask us about that. Neha, you there?
Yeah, hi. I wanted to ask a question very much on that. So I think it's important that as progressives, when we're talking about this, we're really using race-forward messaging, and messaging that doesn't just refer to people of colour as economic units or as people who are here to build populations and to work and simply to be workhorses for the country, but rather that we are people who have worth and should simply exist because of who we are. So my question on that is, do you think it's dangerous to refer to this system, the migration system, as needing control, or using terms like non-genuine refugees, or I guess also talking about the need to clamp down on immigration? And does that not send a dog whistle to white nationalists and the story of fear that decades of scare-based immigration policy and rhetoric has created?
Great. Well, we'll go to you. There's also just one sec. There's also a related question in the chat around your reference. This is from Asher Hirsch from the Refugee Council. Yep. Your reference to 100,000 non-genuine asylum seekers, when we know that they haven't had their claims tested as yet. Yep. So maybe address Neha's question and Ash's as well at the same time.
Let me start with the word control, and then I'll move on to the other dimensions. Control has potentially a negative connotation, especially when you hear it out of the mouth of, say, Peter Dutton. On the other hand, to me, control is about fairness. It's about managing the system in a way that is fair, that is humane, that has integrity, that is efficient in terms of the way it's managed. That, I think, is just good public policy. And that good public policy is important to retaining the confidence of the Australian public generally in the system. Yes, I agree white nationalists will use it as a dog whistle. But every society has a group of, people who think that way, and they will use whatever language you apply negatively. I don't think you can do anything about that. But I think as progressives, if you allow people to get away with talking about open door policies, to me, who that opens the door to is Donald Trump. That's high risk stuff to me, because that's how he refers to progressives policy, as open door. We don't need borders. Anyone and everyone can just come in and do what they like and everything's fine. I don't think that's what most people intend. To the word non-genuine and to Ash's question, I would say the biggest source country of asylum seekers in the last 6 years has been from Malaysia, and the approval rate has been 2%. The vast bulk of those people, I know because I used to manage this part of the system when the Malaysian cohort started to increase, are brought to Australia by agents operating the ETA system in Malaysia, combining with labour hire companies in Australia. It's a labour scam. It's a labour scam that takes advantage of people, relatively poor people, brought to the country, working in appalling conditions, and then when they're used up, they're just spat out of the system. I cannot, for the life of me, understand how that arrangement anyone can say is just fine, let's let it run. We've never been in this situation before. That is, having large numbers of onshore asylum seekers who came through the visa system. We've never got to these numbers before. The cost of managing that process is massive, and the extent to which those individuals are exploited is extraordinary, because they are effectively used as indentured labour. I don't think anyone can say that is a good thing. Whether my words non-genuine are the right words or not, I don't know. I'm happy to hear what words people would suggest I use for a caseload where 98% are being refused.
So,
can I say something quickly
yeah,
on that? I totally agree that language matters, and language and the way that we frame things in the political and the social discourse when we talk about people, often, and as a demographer, our language is and terminology is quite sterile and often sounds and seems quite crude. But I totally agree that in Australia we've got to this point where we fail to recognise this idea of a migrant is a label given to another, someone who is different. And at the core and at the being of every single one of us, we are human. And we fail to recognise time and time again in Australia that we are merely one part of the global community, right? And so this language of otherness, how I refer to it, is something that we use time and time again to display and to maintain our own dominance, whether we realise it or not. And back to this idea of getting control over our immigration system, I would say we need to look at and ensure, just as Abul has said, that the system is fit for purpose, but it's regulated better. So that is that we don't leave it to rogue operators who we know are taking advantage of people, not just people who come from offshore, but also young people and older people in industries where they think they can get away with it. There needs to be greater government regulation. Perhaps that's more about ensuring safety and fairness rather than control.
Yeah, and the reality is that poll after poll shows that Australians generally celebrate a multicultural society. They generally support migration. However, it is extremely hard for people, migrants, whether they're skilled migrants, refugees, people seeking asylum, international students. It's very hard to have a sense of belonging and to feel like you're welcome when the newspapers, the TV, and our political leaders are constantly screaming at them that they really shouldn't be here. They're making our country worse. They're clogging up the roads and etc. And often we hear that the solution is we just need bipartisanship on the issue, or we just need a sensible whole of government approach. Obviously, true leadership will never add prejudice, fear, and division to the conversation, but what can we do about this other than just wishful thinking? One day, maybe we'll have bipartisanship and people won't use racism and migration as a wedge. It's a nice thought, but how do we actually get there? Either of you jump in on that.
Wow, Brad, that's a challenge.
Well, it seems like maybe Canada got there last time round, to a degree at least. So, how do we follow that trajectory?
The only thing I can suggest is if we go back to a system whereby ministers are required to actually be transparent and talk about the system and explain it to us. I think if you go back to 1945 and Arthur Caldwell's maiden speech, or his initial ministerial statement on immigration, he laid out very, very well what we were trying to achieve. And for the next 30 or 40 years, we followed much of what he laid out in that statement in 1945. Somehow, at some period, we've lost our way on that, and the bipartisanship that existed for much of the time in our history broke down. And I'm not sure where we broke down or how we broke down, but the bipartisanship got lost. Maybe it was just in the contentious nature of politics resumed, and there was a decision somehow made that immigration was fair game for political point scoring. Because for a long time, we didn't have immigration used that way.
Yeah, look, for me, and you probably get another feel that I'm thoroughly optimistic and perhaps a little bit naive, but what good thing didn't come from a crazy person with regard to being optimistic and holding great hope for the future? Language matters. Okay, first and foremost, language matters. And that's definitely we are entitled to speak our mind and to hold opinions. There's a fantastic conversation piece from quite a number of years ago that basically says, no, you're not entitled to your opinion unless it's based on facts. And at the moment, our public discourse is being flooded by misinformation and fear-mongering. Language matters. Language in regard to, and I liken this when you're trying to correct a child's speech, and I don't deliberately infantilise people who get opposing views to me. But if someone says something, you say it back to them. So if someone says migrants are taking our jobs, taking the local jobs, say it back to them. Migrants taking local jobs? No. And then you correct them. So they hear what they've said, they hear the meaning of what they've said, and a correction's been given. Language matters. The second thing is that when we look at this polarization and binary approach to we're for or against immigration, right? At the core of this debate, We are all interested in one thing. The common thing among us is we're worried about the future of Australia. That can be a way that we can approach this very sometimes wedge politics, if you like. We come at it from, well, we're in this together, we're concerned about the same. So let's consider the problems based on facts and evidence and how we're going to get to the end. A blueprint, if you like, for the future. But it all starts with language.
Thanks to both of you. I know there's not a simple answer to that question, otherwise we would have all arrived there by now. But I think it's very true that if we keep rewarding the politics of fear and division, then it will keep being used. And language is a significant part of addressing that, and also movements like Democracy in Colour and others that have joined us here in mobilising people to no longer sign up to that very unhealthy way of approaching politics, and to buy into the lies. We're going to go to a couple of questions because we've got 20 minutes left to go. We've got Andrew Dettmer ready to go with a question. Are you there, comrade?
Indeed, I am, brother. Thank you very much. Before I ask my question, I do agree with Liz's point about crazy people need to say things, because we're just commemorating the life of Little Richard, and if we didn't have a wop bobble wop wop bam boom, life would be very different. So I really do think that there's something to be said for being a little bit out there and making statements that make people think, or even using language that make people think. That aside. My question really is to you, Abul, and it's good to see you still active in this field. I do recall, as I said in my comment before, negotiating with you about the skills, the skills list, and that all of that material which we tried to come to some sort of consensus with under both John Howard and Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. Unfortunately, of course, all of that has been destroyed and not resumed. It was destroyed by Tony Abbott, and that entire mechanism of trying to see what was on the skilled migration, temporary migration list, those negotiations no longer take place with unions. So we're just simply told who was going to come and the variety of people. Sorry, not who was going to come, but just simply the category of people. And many thousands of people are recruited and are able to temporarily migrate under a variety of visa schemes. The point that I'm making, though, is one that I made to you many years ago. You possibly don't remember it, fair enough. And that is that unfortunately the temporary migration schemes that we've followed effectively outsource to employers the nature of our migration and the pattern of our migration schemes. Because they're required to be sponsored, many of those million-plus people who are here on temporary migration visas. And I note what you said about them being exploited and how this is completely unacceptable. And I'm not suggesting you're somehow on the side of the devil, but it is really a critical thing that we not outsource our migration policy to employers. I have no doubt that the views of employers do need to be taken into account. People who migrate here do need, for the most part, need to be employed. But the issue for us as a country should be that it should not just be the voice of employers which is heard in practice. And sure, we have governments which pay lip service to the notion of community consultation and developing good programs. But the problem that we have is that the schemes that you are prepared to defend, and I'm not trying to push you into a corner, but you're saying that temporary migration just is sort of a bit misunderstood, maybe a bit like Little Richard. No, but the thing is that what we do is we contract out what is the shape of our society and the type of people and the class of people that come here to employers in many instances. And I just don't think that that's something that is assimilable to good democratic practice, nor does it actually allow us to develop in ways that we want as a community, as opposed to what business might want, which of course leads to things like the exploitative schemes that we have, and which you just, I think, very correctly pointed out with respect to the Malaysian labour brokers, thousands and thousands of Malaysian workers coming here without any rights at all, chewed up, spat out, and in some instances sent back to Malaysia, and in some instances forced to remain here because they have nowhere to go back in Malaysia. So I really do think that's a problem that we do need to address. That temporary migration has changed the mix of our migration and changed the mix of our community, and we're not in control of it as a community.
All right, thanks, Andrew. Abul.
Okay, firstly, let me say, Andrew, thank you for the question. Firstly, there is absolutely no doubt that the immigration system needs to be developed in consultation with the unions, indeed not just with the unions, but with the broader Australian community. And we have lost our ability to do that. So I would agree with you, Andrew. It needs to be in consultation with the unions, but indeed in consultation with the broader community. On that, there can be no doubt. And we have moved away from that. When you refer to the 1 million temporary entrants, it's actually in March 2020, it was 2.17 million. So let's break them down a bit, because I think there is a risk, and this is what I've been concerned about, there is a risk that the characteristics of one small visa category are then applied to all 2.17 million. And that is a risk. The visa category that everyone likes to have a go at is the old 457. It's now called a 482. And it was, quote, tightened by Dutton in a way that, frankly, I think was mad. It now has labour market testing where it's outside a free trade agreement arrangement. It has a variety of other protections, but unless it's administered well, you still have many of the problems with it. But it comprises 6% of the 2.17 million, 6%. So you've got to be careful in saying we've outsourced the program to employers when we're really only talking about 6% of the 2.17 million is actually employer sponsored. So for example, we have the temporary graduate visa, which has about 100,000 people on it, not employer sponsored. The 100,000 asylum seekers are not employer sponsored formally, they're employer exploited, but they're not employer sponsored. Not included in the group. 600,000 students are not employer sponsored. 140,000 working holiday makers are not employer sponsored. So I think we've got to be careful to be blaming employer sponsored visas on this whole 2.17 million. Only a small portion are employer sponsored. And in fact, the ones that are employer sponsored, at least legally and if well administered, have more protections than all of the others.
I would like to add that there is still a process every year where the relevant department, Home Affairs, gets together various stakeholders in different meetings, not with the minister present, but rather government officials, and we discuss what the composition, or they discuss what the composition of the immigration program should look like. So there is some discussion, and I would say that business groups are definitely not the ones that are shaping or moulding what the composition of that immigration intake looks like, the program. Neither is evidence necessarily. We saw recently with a cut that was not based on evidence, that was totally about making it appear that there was a difference ahead of an election to appease very vocal and very powerful elements of the electorate. The other thing I'd like to add too is that the composition of the countries that our migration program is taking people from, the countries of origin, is changing, and it's changing physically what people see around the nation, and that is quite confronting to some people, that idea of visually the other. And that's frightening as well. And what I'd like to say on that is that if we look at the country of origin of migrants to Australia over time, we're changing from the old guard of the European white appearing migrant to something far more diverse, and that's in response to the competition that we have in the global market. And I think it's enriching this nation, and we've got to be aware of that and be mindful that what we say has consequences for people and for families. And again, language matters.
Indeed, and especially you use the word frightening. It's really not frightening unless our leaders are whipping up fear and giving us false reason to be afraid. Of course, new things have a level of getting used to the new world, but fear is something that is generated by the language that is used, and the false accusations that we've all become used to is a big part of that. We've only got 9 minutes to go, so I'm going to quickly throw to Sebastian from Welcoming Cities, who has a question around the pandemic and its impact on temporary migrants. Sebastian, are you there? Sebastian, come in. No.
Hello, I'm back. Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, I'm really interested in the 1.1 million or perhaps more people who are excluded from the job seeker and job keeper payments. The question is in two parts, I suppose. One, what are you hearing now, and how are those impacts playing out? And secondly, to do your best to get your crystal balls out and tell us what's going to happen next, and where this takes us, and what happens to our economies, and including our regional economies, without a lot of these temporary migrants. Thank you.
Over to you.
Do you want,
Either of you.
is that to me?
Jump in.
You can go, Abul.
Okay.
I was just mesmerised by Seb's corona beard.
Yeah.
It has a very Wolverine look to it. I think that's
Look, I think in respect of the temporary migrants, the 2.17 million temporary migrants in Australia, so if we take out the 600 odd thousand New Zealanders from that figure, leaves about 1.4 odd million. And they're the people who do not have access to either JobKeeper or Job Seeker. I think the government has dug itself into a hole on that issue now, and will find it hard to backflip. So it's got to find a way around the hole that it's dug itself into. And in my view, there should be three priorities, three objectives that drive policy in this space. First, the people who are at potential risk of affecting or getting the virus or transmitting the virus because they live in perhaps, dormitories or work in factories, etc., need to have the confidence that if they must self-isolate, as the Prime Minister suggested some of them do before they travel to other parts of the country and work, that they are supported in self-isolating. That is, the public health objective is covered off in this space. That should be objective number one. So if you're going to tell a working holiday maker, you must self-isolate for 2 weeks before you travel to Queensland and then self-isolate for another 2 weeks, well, you've got to support them in doing that. You can't just say, go and do it, as if it's easy to do. Second, I would say we need a policy that ensures that temporary entrants do not face destitution. Okay, the government said we're not prepared to be as generous to them as we are to Aussies. Okay, if that's your position, so be it. But you can't allow them to become destitute. And I think there must be a safety net to prevent destitution. That should be objective number two. The third objective should be there are crucial workers in the 2.17 million which will be needed for the recovery, who are in jobs that are going to be crucial for the recovery. It is absolutely essential the government do whatever it can to retain those people. They would be the three objectives I would pursue in that space.
Thanks, Abul. Liz, we might just throw to one more question and you can answer that one because we're rapidly running out of time. So Ramesh Kumar, are you there? You've got a question about regional migration?
Yeah, look, recently there has been a push to, take the refugees and asylum seekers and migrants into the regional areas. My worry is that, already in the regional areas, because of the lack of infrastructure and lack of livelihood, and because of the, difficulties that we had in terms of unequal distribution of wealth and resources in the country, most of them are in the major eastern corridor, so to speak. And if there are people in rural areas are struggling and they are migrating to the city, what are migrants and refugees going to do there? And is it fair? We need to bring human rights into the discussion of nation building.
Very quick answer to the question, which is a highly complex and important one. People, no matter where they're locals or migrants, go and live where the jobs are. Fact of life, and that's an important aspect. That's what we want. If we are to push people into areas where there aren't opportunities, there will be very quickly people move into the areas where they're being pushed from. So if you tell people to leave Sydney and take up opportunities in the regions, that vacuum will be filled very quickly in Sydney. So we need to and decentralisation has not been effective to date in Australia. We've proven it over and over again. What we've proven though during coronavirus shutdown is that we can telecommute more effectively. And we should be able to rely on our telecommunications network to be able to do that. So there are many opportunities now that in a very changed world, we can reconsider all of these things on the table. And part of that is how do we make the system more equal and Australian society more equal for all of those who participate.
Yeah, that's a great line to finish on there, Dr. Liz, because we can hopefully assume most of the audience here assumes and wants the same thing as both of you, and that I want national leadership that builds a future where everyone in Australia is able to belong, contribute and thrive with a prosperous economy that everyone can share in equally, living in healthy, harmonious communities. It sounds like a pipe dream, but it's what we're all gunning for. To finish off, we'll go to Abul first, then Dr. Liz. Please tell us one practical thing we can all do to help build that future together. And when we get to you, Dr. Liz, please tell us about your book launch and how we can hear more about that as well. So Abul, over to you. One practical thing we can do to build a society where everyone can belong, contribute and thrive.
30% of the Australian population has been born overseas, which means wherever you live, the odds are the person across the road or the person to the left of you or the person to the right of you, one of them is probably a migrant family. As the coronavirus restrictions are lifted, I'd encourage you to go next door, tap on the door and welcome them and join them for a cup of tea or a beer.
Perfect. Dr. Liz, tell us about your book and one thing we can do.
Yeah, so I'll the book you can jump online. Glebe Books is very kindly helping me launch a book that describes my lived experience about why demography matters as a poor kid who grew up through poor circumstances and through opportunities. Has hopefully come good, maybe, yeah. So on that note, I would say that opportunities are important and they're important for all. And if we can take the opportunity to call out harmful language and harmful rhetoric, so that we can be and achieve what we all at the heart of our interests care about, and that is the future of Australia. So take the opportunity. The harmful language together.
Awesome. And there is a link to Dr. Liz's book and launch in the chat. So I'd love to say thank you to everyone for coming along this afternoon. It's been a fantastic conversation. Obviously a very complex area that we could talk about forever, but please get involved in one of the many organisations that are pushing for change. Welcoming Australia, Refugee Council, Democracy in Colour are all part of this conversation, but there are also many others who are trying to raise funds to support those temporary migrants that have been left out of our JobKeeper, JobSeeker, and pushing for change there, and others that are just pushing for a more welcoming, inclusive society for everyone. So please get involved in being a part of the difference that we need to see for our future to be healthy and strong. Thanks everyone, and join us again tomorrow, 1 p.m. Thank you to Essential, Principal Co and The Guardian for all of this. Farewell.